Hi, I'm Benton Stokes.
And I'm Elane O'Rourke.
And this is Cocktail Theology. So here we are in fall.
Yes.
We just got back from a little adventure down to the southeast, and we got to enjoy some changing leaves.
We did.
Lovely.
And see some of our Cocktail Theology supporters.
That's right.
Which was awesome.
Indeed. It was good to have a bit of a getaway. And today we are having a fallish cocktail.
We are.
That I'm calling the Dusty Apple.
A dusty apple.
Yeah.
Is that because this room is dusty and you're trying to make a point?
No.
Oh, okay.
No. It is a rather dry cocktail.
It is.
So I think when people think of apple cocktails, we tend to think of sweet. Mm-hmm. And many of them are. Mm-hmm. But this one is not as sweet. It's definitely on the drier side.
Very much so.
So we used Calvados, which is a really nice apple brandy.
Mm-hmm. And it actually is Calvados. We actually used French Calvados.
Yes.
Which matters because it has a different flavor profile than like apple brandy from the United States.
Right. It's not Applejack. It's something else. And then it has some sweet vermouth. I kind of patterned this after a recipe that I found on Difford's Guide, which if you haven't been on Difford's Guide for your cocktail recipes, it's a really interesting site. It gives you tons of information, cross-references all kinds of cocktails. But anyway. And so this is the Calvados. I cut the vermouth that they suggested in half. Uh-huh. It is a sweet vermouth. We added a little Fernet Branca, which from a few episodes ago you'll remember is very herbaceous, kind of leans into mint and anise a little bit, and it's really an interesting flavor, and you have to use it very sparingly. Very sparingly. And then it got some of Hella's apple blossom bitters.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. We'll try this again for real. So
let's try it for realsies.
I like what the Fernet did to it.
I do too.
You know, I was thinking the sweet vermouth that you used is not as sweet as many sweet vermouths are, right? You use the Dolan Rouge.
The Dolan Rouge. Mm-hmm.
It'd be really interesting to use something like Carpano Antico.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's sweet as opposed to dry, but it's not sweet like other vermouths are sweet. It's got a lot more kind of herbal feel to it. That could be kind of interesting.
Oh, yeah. That's a really good suggestion. I like that.
We'll have to try that the next 8 times we try to make this.
Yes.
Okay. Very good.
Sounds
I like
good.
that idea. Okay.
So that's our cocktail. Mm-hmm. And today our topic comes from listener Sam.
It does come from listener Sam. So listener Sam asked me about, and it was me because we were having a conversation. Mm-hmm. He asked me about denominations, about how there could be over 10,000 denominations in the United States.
Right.
But he didn't phrase it that way. His phrasing was, if we're all worshiping the same God, why don't we all worship together? Mm-hmm. Why don't we all worship the same way?
It's a fair question.
It is a fair question. And you'll be very, very proud of me because I did not launch into a 3-hour history of why we don't all worship the same way. I held back in such a lovely, restrained way that all of our listeners would be extremely proud, and Sam would be grateful if he had known that I had planned to go that way. Mm-hmm, but I think it is an interesting question. It seems like there are maybe 3 or 4 different kinds of questions in this. One is the 10,000 denominations thing. One is what it means to worship the same God. Mm-hmm. Another one is how we have different traditions given that. Like for example, I'm thinking about, what I've termed the revivalist churches versus the historic churches. Mm-hmm. The historic churches focus on Eucharist. Mm-hmm. Revivalist churches focus on the sermon.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Right.
Right. So there are all of these questions in that. Why don't we all worship the same way? Why don't we all see God the same way? And if we worship differently, are we in fact worshiping the same God, or is there a secret we haven't thought about? So lots of those.
Yeah.
Feel free to select one.
That's all very interesting.
It all is very interesting. It's at least 5 episodes. So we're just going to take one today.
Yeah. And I know you and I have had many conversations about this and similar topics in the past. Mm-hmm. I mean, Baptists alone, you could just spend hours and hours and hours dissecting all the Baptist churches. But really, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but from our conversations, my understanding I'll pick on Baptists for a minute. The reason why there are so many different Baptists, so there is a grouping that is Baptist, and there are things that basically all Baptists believe, and they're very broad. And then from that, you have distinctions based on little things like the inerrancy of Scripture or how to do baptism, things like that. And then you have regional differences, which add to the distinctions. Now, is it true that Baptists actually don't necessarily all connect to the same initial stream? Or do they all start in the same place?
I think the official line is that they all came out of the Anabaptists, but I don't think that's accurate.
Okay.
There are some basic, and I would say these aren't actually theological things. They are ways of thinking about what it means to be a congregation that are very Baptist. One of them is that, this is not the language that Baptists would use, but it was that each person is to be trusted with that person's experience of God.
Okay.
And the idea is that you can sort through God as an independent person. And it comes out of the idea you don't need a priest to tell you who God is.
Right.
So there's this sense of freedom in the way you think about it, in the personal way of thinking about it. Now, that's different than how you live together, right? But there's that, and that connects Baptists in a particular, or is supposed to connect Baptists in a particular way.
Okay, I got you.
Right? So there's some theological things, but what has traditionally distinguished Baptists is these principles about what it means to access God.
Okay.
More like that.
So that would be a core thing that basically all Baptists, if they really call them and believe that they're Baptists, then those are things that they all basically share.
Yep.
Yeah, but you have Baptist churches that are more Pentecostal in flavor. You have Baptist churches that come out of an African American tradition. You have Baptist churches that are very literalist in the reading of the Scripture. It's not enough to say Baptist.
Exactly.
There are just too many distinctions.
Exactly. Another thing they should all hold in common, and I say should only in that kind of way we think about organizing denominations, is that you should believe in what we call believer's baptism, that is adult baptism, and you softer should believe in full immersion.
I get that.
So those pieces are also Baptist, they're called distinctives. The way of thinking is called a distinctive in the Baptist tradition. So those are also things that would tend to bind Baptists together.
And then also within Baptists, you have differences on the social aspects, right? So I was a worship leader at an American Baptist church, which was unlike any Baptist church I had ever been acquainted with. They were what most Baptists would call liberal in that they ordain women, but even those congregations are different one to another.
Yes.
So some were very accepting of people with gender differences, for instance, and others not so much. While doctrinally, they believe basically the same thing. The way that it is lived out in their local place might be flavored differently.
Yep. Right. And just to staying on Baptists, and American Baptists for I don't know how many decades were considered kind of the liberal stretch of Baptists, period. There's been some changing of that, but put them over there for the moment. National Baptists tends to be a historically black Baptist tradition, right? So you've got some things like that. But if you think about within the Southern Baptists, which have a very, very strong political bent to them and have worked together to effect political change or attitudes.
Yeah.
Even there, where they're pushed pretty hard to believe exactly the same things, or at least profess exactly the same things. You've got that whole thing with Rick Warren winding up leaving the Southern Baptist Convention, right? I think we talked about that in another episode, because he believes that women should be engaged in preaching and teaching, which is not a Southern Baptist way of thinking. So you've even got dynamic relations within something that works pretty hard to be uniform.
Right.
Right? All right, so let's back up from denominations, period.
Okay, yeah.
Because if you go back to the Tower of Babel, I think there's a myth in the Tower of Babel, and again, doesn't mean falsehood, means non-historical, right? There's a myth in the Tower of Babel that's really important. And that idea that when human beings worked together to try and not only reach God, but become God, God said, no,
Right.
and scattered them.
Right.
Okay? So if you take that myth that we are essentially, or have become essentially, a scattering group of creatures, that means that whenever we get into a fight, if our faith comes out of a community or individual understanding, so if we think that it comes, if you will, bottom up, there's absolutely no reason not to split.
Okay.
Right? The historical churches, because they have a sense that they all come from Peter, I touch this one, touch this one, and the Eucharist is what holds them together rather than doctrine.
Yes.
There's less reason to split. Now, that's changed to some degree for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with the kind of church they are. But if it comes from this group of people feels the movement of the Holy Spirit and becomes church, there's no reason not to split, because it wasn't about unity to begin with.
Right. That's why we see so many more denominations on the revivalist side.
Exactly.
Than on the historic side.
Exactly. We are inclined to disagree and walk away rather than disagree and figure it out.
Yeah.
We would much rather be divided and think we're right than be united and possibly be wrong. We hate being wrong.
Yeah.
So that's another reason for all of the divisions. But to the question of if we're all worshiping the same God, it is my opinion that liberal Muslims and liberal Christians worship the same God. Conservative, whatever that means, Christians and conservative Muslims probably worship the same God.
I see what you're saying.
But liberal Christians and conservative Christians often don't actually worship the same God.
Yes.
And what I mean by that is not that there is more than one God.
Right.
It means that their concept of God is so utterly different that they might as well be worshiping two different gods.
Definitely. I know the difference between how I understand God now versus how I was taught about God as a kid are dramatically different views of the same God. So yeah, when you're talking to a fundamentalist, they're going to see God as sort of angry and kind of like already has everything figured out, and it's our job to figure God out, and God doesn't really bend to us that way. Where my understanding of God now is not like that at all. I don't experience God as somebody that has already mapped out my life, and I'd better stay on the straight and narrow or I'm screwed. Now that I understand that God, first of all, can change God's mind, that's a big one. And understanding that God is accepting and loving toward all of us, regardless of where we are on our life's journey, whatever that looks like. That's a big one. I don't have to earn God's favor, of course.
And you can't.
I can't. Right. All those distinctions. I think you're exactly right. I think the God that I understand is probably much more similar to what liberal Jews and liberal Muslims understand as God than really conservative Christians do.
Yep, I would completely agree.
That's a big statement too.
It's a big statement, and I'm going to state it one more time just for the record. I think that liberal/progressive Christians do not worship the same God as conservative/fundamentalist Christians. I don't think we worship the same God because our conception of that God is so different.
So different.
That our activity of worship, our activity of approaching God, the way we talk to each other, the way we conceive of our relationship with other people is so different that it might as well be a different entity that we are worshiping. Now, do I believe there's more than one God? No. But from those perspectives, might as well be more than one God.
Yeah, because they sure don't look very
because
much
they don't look at all alike. They don't look at all alike. Now, I think that there's some truth in all of it. I think that liberal and progressive, that wing of Christianity, has something to teach the other end. I think the other end has something to teach liberal and progressive. That whole relationship with Jesus thing, right? So much deeper and more thoughtful and more heartfelt on the conservative ends than on the liberal ends, right?
Yeah.
There's something that we have to teach each other. But bottom line, the way we conceive God, it might as well not be the same God.
Right.
And the great part about that is God can hold all of that in tension. God's got it, right? God is not sitting there fretting over whether God is being misunderstood. God understands that people who experience God as an authoritative father figure, the way that the conservative side does, the one who sets the rules, rewards through inheritance, so forth, and then the people who consider God to be a more, I hate to use this word, but it's more a feminine picture, a more egalitarian, raise your children upright, set them on the right path kind of God. God's fine with all of it.
Right.
But we approach God so differently that it might as well be two different beings.
Right. Okay, so then going back to Sam's question, why don't we all worship together? Is that something we should aspire to? I mean, is that something we should work toward, having a common view, a common enough experience of God to where we can all meaningfully worship together?
Wow, there's so many things in that. Jesus prayed that we could all be of one mind. Jesus did not talk at all about practices other than loving neighbor, loving God, being good to others, forgiving sins, those kinds of practices.
Right.
Jesus did not say things about whether you should blow the shofar on this particular holiday or that, that wasn't a thing Jesus talked about.
Right.
So the distinctives between us about ritual may not be as important, potentially. And sometimes those ritual things are the things that really get into people's, right? Like if I cross myself and I'm on the liberal end of the spectrum, people freak out. Well, I cross myself, suck it up, right?
Yeah.
Those kinds of distinctives may not be so important. So the question is, are we willing to just allow people to do what they want?
Yeah.
And in general, no, we're not.
It's true.
We're just not comfortable with it, right? Right? Peter and Paul went in different directions and argued about what it meant to be a Christian or a Jesus follower in that first century time. I mean, the disciples didn't agree.
Yeah.
I don't have a lot of hope for us to agree on what it means to worship God, both for kind of trivial reasons, but also for that we're in different places. We're in very different places in the way we approach God. Our culture is different. Our experience of God is different.
Yeah.
If I come out of an abusive family, I'm going to experience God differently than somebody who doesn't.
Yeah.
Because God is going to meet me where I am, and I'm going to see God through my experience.
Right.
Even on an individual basis, we're going to experience God differently. I'm not sure about the should part. For me, I think it's incredibly important to be humble in my assessment of whether someone is really a Christian or not.
Yeah.
I try very, very hard not to say, well, Matilda isn't a Christian because Matilda didn't do X, Y, Z, or Matilda did do A, B, C. Really try hard not to determine her identity based on her behavior.
Right, right.
I think that's a good way to go. I don't think most of us think that way because we want to figure out who's in our group, who isn't. That's part of kind of the tribalism of humanity.
Yes. Right. And our society is so tribalist
That's right
now. And it's easy to see why churches like the United Methodist Church are dividing over social issues because we behave like two different countries. And of course, if you're in one country, you're not going to see things the way the other country does.
That's right.
These are things that, again, go back to your view of God. I mean, talking about the Methodists for a minute, if they're splitting over whether queer folks are welcome in their churches, well, one view of God says yes, and the other view of God says, well, no. Right. Of course, that's a hill people are willing to die on because you're not going to say, well, that's what you're saying is incredibly inconsistent with the understanding of God that I have.
Right. I think the part that's mystifying for me, and maybe is for Sam, I don't know. Sam, let me know. Is why are we willing to die on that hill as opposed to the hill of whether people are fed? Why aren't we willing to die on that hill?
Yeah.
Why doesn't that define us?
Yeah.
Why doesn't being kind to each other the thing that binds us together, as opposed to this sort of cardboard cutout of Jesus that every church hauls up at some point?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Why, as human beings, and it really is as human beings, it's not about being Christian. Why, as human beings, are we so willing to invest everything we are, including our humanity, in it's not trivia because it affects people's lives, but it's not fundamental because sin.
Right.
And, when I say sin, I mean the context of stepping away from God and each other. We are very, very prone to doing that as human beings.
Yeah.
So I guess my answer for Sam would be, should we all worship God the same way? I'm not sure the same way matters too much, and I'm not sure worshiping together matters too much. And I don't personally believe that we're ever all going to have the same experience of God until we're all in the presence of God. And maybe not even then.
And maybe not even then. Right. Yeah, this is, like you mentioned at the beginning of this episode, we can take this conversation a lot of different ways and spend a lot of time here. But listeners, we would love to know what we discussed today resonated with you or maybe rubbed you the wrong way. Let us know. You can find us at cocktailtheology.com. This is just it's so indicative when you look at all the different denominations that exist. It's just so indicative of us as human beings and how we tend to form our beliefs and then find other people that look and sound like us, think like us, and then we all band together and create our own little groups.
Yep.
And it's tribalism.
Yep.
And so I think that is at the heart of much of this. But listeners, we would love to hear from you. Please reach out.
Yeah. And if you have the hill you're willing to die on about your faith, or really about anything at all, we'd love to hear what that is. That's another episode too. Okay, let's hold that for another episode, but we'd love to hear from you.
We still want to hear it.
Yeah, we'd still want to hear it from you.
Thanks for listening, folks. Please subscribe wherever you are, and we will catch you next time.
Bye.